and let's get started. Mohandas Gandhi once said, quote, "No culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive," end quote. It is because I agree with Gandhi and believe that culture should include others and benefit from their contributions that I support the resolution. Culture ought to value assimilation over multiculturalism. Let's start by clarifying what we mean. The American Heritage Dictionary defines culture as the arts, beliefs, customs, institutions, and other products of human work and thought considered as a unit, especially with regard to a particular time or social group. It also defines assimilation as the process whereby a minority group gradually adopts the customs and attitudes of the prevailing culture. Finally, Oxford Lexico defines multiculturalism as the presence of, or support for the presence of, several distinct cultural or ethnic groups within a society. As we discuss which of these options should be culture's priority, I offer the value of societal improvement. Societal improvement is the process of a society becoming closer and closer to the ideal society, which is one whose beliefs are true and whose way of life reflects correct values and is practically beneficial. The reason to use this value is inherently valuable. Truth, correct values, and practical benefits, when all taken together, are always a good thing. The ideal society is inherently valuable. Now, societal improvement is a very broad concept, so let's look at a specific way to achieve that, or my criterion of mutual influence. Mutual influence is the process by which people or groups influence each other by sharing their respective ideas with each other. An example of mutual influence is the musical genre of jazz, which was developed by African Americans who were influenced by European music. There are two reasons why mutual influence promotes societal improvement. Reason one is higher probability. From simple math, we can see that the more ideas that are shared in a society, the higher the probability would be that there is a good idea in there somewhere that will come to the surface and be adopted. Reason two is balanced perspective. People from different cultures have vastly different perspectives, so when they influence each other, they each get influenced by the other half of the picture, thus achieving a more balanced perspective. So our question becomes, does assimilation or multiculturalism best facilitate our criterion of mutual influence? To answer this, let's look at an important factor in this decision, cultural commonality. Contention one, cultural commonality promotes mutual influence. There are two main ways in which cultural commonality promotes mutual influence. I'll be exploring these in two subpoints. Subpoint A, communication. Many cultural traits directly impact communication, such as language, which is a downright necessity, and basic customs, such as gestures. In certain Arab countries, it is an insult to show the soles of your feet, which is something that we here in the United States would not blink an eye at. So when we have uniformity in these aspects of culture, we find it not only possible to communicate, we find it easier to communicate without being misunderstood. Subpoint B is trust. Cultural commonality in areas that do not directly affect communication still does create trust that promotes mutual influence. First of all, commonality creates external similarity. Whether for good or for bad, we all naturally find it easier to relate to and interact with people who are culturally similar to ourselves. We naturally trust them. Secondly, commonality promotes living in physical proximity. People who are different from each other automatically tend to form their own little sections of a community, such as a Chinatown or a Little Italy, which tend to create an us versus them type of scenario instead of one cohesive, trust-filled community. Finally, commonality indicates respect for values. Let's say I lived in Israel. If I chose to eat kosher, then that would at least indicate to all my Jewish neighbors that I respect their values, even if I do not agree with them, and I would earn a measure of their trust. In sum, cultural commonality is not only beneficial for basic communication, but it fosters trust, which is a key ingredient for interaction between people who would otherwise tend to avoid each other. Now that we've seen that cultural commonality promotes mutual influence, the question becomes, does assimilation or multiculturalism create more commonality? Contention two, multiculturalism limits cultural commonality. While it is true that some common ground can exist in multiculturalism, such as following the same laws and other necessities, commonality is inherently limited because multiculturalism expects people from different cultures to remain different. Let's look at a real-world example. Example one, Western missionaries to China. When Western missionaries were working in China in the 19th century, many of them decided to keep their own culture while living and working in China. They kept their Western clothing, worked in mission compounds, and otherwise tried to avoid assimilating into Chinese culture. According to historian Paul A. Cohen, quote, "From the time they arrived in China until the time they left, the missionaries lived and worked in the highly organized structure of the mission compound, which resulted in their effective segregation, psychological as well as physical, from the surrounding Chinese society," end quote. While the missionaries lived in the same geographical space as the Chinese, their influence was severely restricted because they distanced themselves culturally. Contention 3: assimilation creates cultural commonality. In addition to the common ground that multiculturalism allows for, assimilation creates commonality on a cultural level. By fostering communication and trust, assimilation thus aids mutual influence. We'll see how this turned out in the exact same country and time period as our previous example. Example 2: the China Inland Mission. Hudson Taylor, the founder of the China Inland Mission, decided that to influence the Chinese, he was going to assimilate into their culture. Taylor learned 4 Chinese dialects, lived right among the Chinese in Chinese style accommodations, put on the billowy Chinese clothing, cut his hair into the traditional hairstyle, and his fellow missionaries followed suit. Their choice to assimilate greatly improved their ability to communicate, increased their measure of trust with the Chinese people, and greatly helped their efforts to influence them. In Taylor's own words, quote, "We do find that we are influencing the Chinese around us in a way which we could not otherwise have done," end quote. We can see from his example that the best way to influence culture is to first be a part of it.
All right, awesome. So I'll assume that everyone is set to go then. And this is going to be a 3-minute cross-examination. Let's get started. Would you say that assimilation is a process that requires change?
Yes.
Okay, and in that process of change, can a person adopt the dominant culture while losing most, if not all, of his or her original culture?
Yes, it depends on the degree to which you value assimilation over multiculturalism.
Okay, would you say that when somebody has assimilated, they identify, let's just say an immigrant goes to another country, when they have assimilated, would you say that they would have to identify with that new culture and they adopt the majority of their beliefs and customs in their way of life?
Again, it would depend on the degree to which they value assimilation, but yes, they have to identify and adopt at least some things. Valuing assimilation over multiculturalism would mean adopting most things, but you don't have to adopt everything.
Okay, interesting. Let's get down to the multiculturalism. So essentially, would you say that multiculturalism is the presence of distinct cultures coexisting together in a society?
Now, my definition was almost that. It was the presence of or support for the presence of several distinct cultural or ethnic groups within a society.
Okay, would you say that a big part can also, it says support for the presence of. So would you say there's also an environment of respect for different cultures?
Yes, but respecting cultural barriers doesn't really help you overcome them. I could respect this wall over here, but I still can't climb over it.
Okay, interesting. Let's get down to your criterion under your value of mutual influence. Now, you basically said that with mutual influence, the truth rises to the surface and bad ideas basically disappear, essentially, right?
That's essentially what I was saying. I was more saying there's a higher probability of the truth being included in your mix of cultural ideas.
Okay, are there scenarios where the truth doesn't rise to the top?
Probably, but that usually occurs when the truth is actually suppressed. That's the reason why when dictators take control, they control the media and they try to limit the source of information.
Okay, let's get down to your application then of communication, as the first contention in your subpoints. So basically, you talked about basically learning the language and learning a little bit of the customs. Now, if I learn to speak French, does that mean that I've assimilated into French culture?
No, and that's not what I was saying.
Okay, what were you? Can you clarify your point on the
Yeah, my
communication?
subpoint A dealt with cultural traits that directly impact communication, such as language, body language, gestures, things like that. My subpoint B of trust dealt with non communication based attributes, such as clothing, food, things like that.
Okay. Now, since the resolution says culture ought to value, what does it look like for culture to value assimilation?
The majority of people or a defining characteristic of the people in that culture consider assimilation to be a good thing.
Okay. Would you say that in order for it to work, would you say that there has to be some level of enforcement?
No.
So completely voluntary, just to be clear.
That's what it means to value assimilation. You think it's a good thing.
Okay, interesting. Are there instances where the minority doesn't necessarily want to change their customs, their beliefs, sometimes their religion, their behaviors?
Yes, there are instances where minorities don't value assimilation, but they should.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. And I'm going to be starting my 3 minutes of prep time. Okay, I have 1 minute 39 seconds remaining of prep time. And I'll assume that everyone is set to go. And this is going to be a 7-minute constructive speech. Let's get started. Between 1910 and 1970, roughly 100,000 children of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent were removed from their families by the Australian government. Why? Because the government wanted to assimilate them to the dominant culture. And it's because of actions like these that I simply cannot agree with the affirmative and why I firmly negate today's resolution. Now, to start off, I'm going to be agreeing to all my opponent's definitions, and I would like to also point you back to the clarifications I made in cross-sex, how assimilation can result sometimes in someone completely losing their original culture, and multiculturalism is also about not just the presence of different cultures coexisting, but also sometimes the support or mutual respect for different cultures. But let's get down to a point of resolutional analysis or some framework. You can write that down as culture is the actor. Culture is the actor. Subpoint A is group, not individuals. Here's an example. Let's say my sister, my mom and dad and I decide to eat Chick-fil-A for lunch, but my two brothers want KFC instead. Unfortunately, since the family as a whole made the decision, my brothers don't have a choice. And this resolution works the same way because it's not asking whether an individual should choose to assimilate, but rather whether culture as a whole should make that decision for them. And invariably, there will be people in the society that don't want to assimilate to the culture provided. Subpoint B is no specific culture. The resolution never specified which culture we're talking about. So in order for my opponent to win this round, he has to show you that the process of assimilation is best for culture as a whole across the world. But let's get down to my counter value, which is liberty. Liberty is defined by Lexico Power by Oxford as the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. My reason to prefer this value is fundamental human right. Liberty grants us the ability to live our lives without being oppressed by the government. It's what separates us from animals, the freedom to make our own choices. It is a fundamental human right that we are morally obligated to uphold. Thus, is an adequate way to measure this resolution. Now, in response to my opponent's value of societal improvement and value link of inherently valuable, my first response is liberty first. Make no mistake, societal improvement is awesome, but we can't have it if we're oppressed. Before any culture or society can move forward, it must be free from oppression. So liberty is higher because it is what you use to get to my opponent's value. My second response is not intrinsically good. Societal improvement is relative not simply to some different individuals, but also to different nations. Different nations have different views on what an ideal society looks like. What America views as an ideal society is wildly different from communist countries like China and North Korea. So it's not intrinsically good. I urge you to prefer liberty. But let's get down to my opponent's criterion of mutual influence. And I'm going to group respond to his reasons to prefer with one response. Assimilation suppresses. The problem with this, if we value assimilation over multiculturalism, it actually allows, in certain instances, for the suppression of truth. We see this in communist countries like China, North Korea, and countries in the Middle East, where they suppress ideas, many times good ones, for example, Christianity. The idea that truth will automatically rise to the surface isn't true at all. So the reality is assimilation can actually suppress mutual influence. Let's get down to my first contention, which is assimilation harms liberty. Assimilation harms liberty. When assimilation is prioritized, people around the world have their liberty violated because they're often pressured and forced to believe or act differently from what they choose. An example of this is Native American boarding schools. Starting in 1879, 150 Native American boarding schools opened across the US. And according to history.com, quote, the end goal of these measures was to make Native people more like the white Anglo-Americans who had taken over their land, end quote. And at the school, staff forced indigenous students to cut their hair, use new American names, and they forbade children from speaking their native language and observing their religious and cultural practices. The impact is that when we prioritize assimilation, we end up with cruel scenarios like this, where we violate the liberty of other people. In this instance, the United States forced assimilation toward the Native Americans without their consent, which harmed their liberty. Prioritizing assimilation harms liberty. But my second contention is multiculturalism preserves liberty. Multiculturalism preserves liberty. And my second application is Singapore. Singapore is a perfect example of a multicultural country. Located about 85 miles north of the equator in Southeast Asia, this small nation is one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse in the world. Tom Benner wrote for the Fair Observer in 2016, quote, Singapore sets an example for the world on multiculturalism. It made an asset of its ethnic and religious diversity, and the result is relative racial harmony, end quote. The nation's prime minister stated that, quote, Singapore is not a melting pot, but a society where each race is encouraged to preserve its unique culture and traditions and appreciate and respect that of others, end quote. And Singapore is a first world country, has the world's freest economy, the third highest GDP per capita, and is one of the top 20 countries with the lowest crime rates. The impact is that when we value multiculturalism, we uphold liberty for every person regardless of their culture, and we do not unjustly restrict their beliefs and practices. Prioritizing multiculturalism preserves liberty. Let's get down to my opponent's first contention as subpoint A of communication. My response is learning the language and customs isn't necessarily assimilation. Let's say I go to Britain, I'll follow the rules. I'll drive on the left side of the road, but that doesn't mean that I actually identify as British and I actually adopt the majority of their beliefs and values and behaviors in my way of life. Subpoint B of trust, my response is assimilation hurts. If we value assimilation, especially from the dominant culture's perspective, you are allowing them to view certain cultures as inferior, which can actually develop into discrimination and distrust. Let's get down to my opponent's second contention and application of missionaries in China. My response is isolation is not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism isn't everyone completely isolated from each other. It's the presence of distinct cultures and a support for that coexisting together. This is a problem with isolation and segregation, like my opponent stated, not multiculturalism. Finally, under my opponent's third contention and application of Chinese inland mission, my response is individual choice. Sure, maybe Hudson Taylor chose to become more Chinese, but the resolution isn't talking about individual choice, it's talking about culture as a whole. But I want to give one observation point for my entire opponent's affirmative case, which is that of not real world. My opponent made the point that assimilation should be completely voluntary, but the problem is that doesn't happen in the real world. The minority group doesn't always want to assimilate to the dominant culture. That's not, in a perfect utopia, that would be the case, but it is not. My opponent's idea that assimilation should always be voluntary and that minority groups should always value it is not real world. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
All right. And if everyone could still hear me okay, I will begin 3 minutes of cross-examination.
Sure.
All right. Does our resolution say that some specific cultures should value assimilation or that culture in general should value assimilation?
I would say that culture as a whole.
Okay, so there's no limiter on which specific cultures are valuing assimilation, correct?
Yeah, we're not talking about like, oh, the United States should value
Yeah.
assimilation. No.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that the resolution is simply saying that all culture should value assimilation?
Yeah, I would, in that sense, yes, but again, there's room for arguing that that shouldn't be the case either.
Okay, thank you. Is communism a good thing?
No,
Okay, even though communistic societies think it's a good thing, it's still not a good thing, correct?
it's not a good thing. I mean, for us, our perspective is not a good thing. The problem is that we shouldn't assimilate to that ideology, and there are a lot of countries that actually, value communism.
Okay, so just to confirm, you're saying that communism is not a good thing for us, but for other people it might be?
I would say that, I mean, for us here, I would say that communism is bad, but the reality is, I mean, I believe it's bad. I would say that, sure, it's objectively bad, but I wouldn't,
Okay.
but again, that doesn't discount the fact that assimilation can allow for that.
Okay, so so we can agree that just because different people disagree on what the truth is, doesn't mean that the truth isn't itself objective, and there are certain things that are always good and always bad, correct?
I would say, yeah, truth is
Okay.
objective.
All right.
There
Is it a
objective
good
truth.
thing to value making money?
I would say that you should make money in a moral way.
Okay.
Let's,
All right. So we can agree that there may be a moral way to value making money and an immoral way to value making money, correct?
yeah, it depends on, yeah.
Sure.
You could
But
say it.
as a rule, is it a good thing to value making money?
Well, it depends on your intentions, so it could be entirely situational. And
Okay, thank you.
I can't say for a general rule that making money is always good.
Okay, thank you. Does our resolution say that culture does value assimilation or that culture should value assimilation?
Well, it says ought,
Okay.
so
Okay, so we can agree that we're talking about what the world should look like, correct?
you could say that.
Yeah, okay. So if the resolution were true, then the things in the resolution would be happening in the world, correct?
Yeah, but again, there's room for arguing that that maybe shouldn't be the case.
Okay, could you elaborate on that then?
Yeah, so basically the idea that because the resolution didn't give us an indicator of what culture we should assimilate to,
Hmm.
so there's room for arguing that like the resolution provided no standard for what we're assimilating to.
Okay.
So you know,
Okay, but we agreed upon that it's generally acceptable or it's reasonable to think of all cultures valuing assimilation because there is no limiter, correct?
well, there's room for arguing, sure.
Well, I know there's room for argument, but what is your position?
Yeah, I would say that in the idea that all cultures ought to value assimilation, sure, maybe talking about things like that. So okay.
Okay, thank you. I will start 3 minutes of prep time.
Interesting one.
All right, I have 1 minute and 34 seconds remaining of prep time. And assuming that everyone can still hear me, I will set my timer for a 4-minute speech. The best way to communicate is to be on the same cultural phone line. And it's because I believe that different cultures in a society should share the same phone line and thus be able to influence each other mutually for the improvement of their society that I stand that culture ought to value assimilation. Let's look at some of my opponent's arguments. His resolutional analysis was that culture is the actor. I have a couple responses to this. First, all culture is the actor. I agree, we're talking about culture valuing things, but as we established in cross-examination, we're talking about culture in general, all cultures valuing assimilation. My second response to this is cultural value held by its members. He brought up this example of his family valuing going to KFC while he specifically didn't. Well, if he didn't share in that cultural value, there is a good argument for saying he's actually not part of that culture. He's part of the family, but because he doesn't share that cultural value, which is a critical part of that culture, he's just not a part of that culture in the same way that the other people are. So now that we've established that we are talking about what people value because they are the members of culture, let's talk about his arguments. I'm actually going to skip his value for now and his second contention and only focus in on his first contention, and I'll show you why in a minute. My two responses to his first contention are, first of all, what versus how. You see, the resolution asks us what we should value, not how we should value it. Just like free speech is a good thing, but there are many bad ways to value free speech, including saying lots of rude words over the radio, likewise, there are many bad ways to value assimilation. Doesn't necessarily mean assimilation is a bad thing. Then my second response is all culture should value. Again, the minority groups in this example did not value assimilation, and that's why the government forced them to. But if the resolution were true, and the things that happened in the resolution happened in the real world, then this would not have happened. Everyone would have agreed assimilation was a good thing, and they wouldn't have needed to force anyone. So now that we've established that my opponent's first contention is wrong because he's talking about a limited perspective of the resolution that isn't really resolutional, let's look at the rest of his case. My opponent's case is really a logical syllogism with two basic premises. The premise one is that liberty should be the priority, and premise two is that multiculturalism achieves it better than assimilation. If either of these premises fall, then his entire argument falls. And what I've just demonstrated is that his second premise, that multiculturalism achieves it more than assimilation, is unsupported. Because all he's proven is that multiculturalism achieves liberty, but he hasn't shown how assimilation harms it in any way because he's talking about something we're not supposed to be talking about. Because my opponent has to actually compare these two things, he hasn't done that. His second premise is unsupported, and his entire argument falls. So my response to his second contention is simply no impact. I can agree that multiculturalism promotes liberty, but until he shows us that assimilation harms it more than multiculturalism promotes it, it's not impactful to this round. And likewise, his value of liberty doesn't help us decide, because unless he shows that it actually helps us make a decision, which is the purpose of a value, it simply is irrelevant to this round. So now let's get into my case. The last thing I said directly responds to what he said about liberty first. I agree, liberty is valuable, it's simply not relevant to this round. He hasn't shown us how it helps us make a decision. Then he said societal improvement is not inherently good. My response is objective truth. Sure, people disagree about what the truth is, but that doesn't mean that there are some things that are objectively good and we should be pursuing them. Then he responded to my criterion by saying assimilation suppresses. My response is expectations, not rules. You see, culture sets the expectations, but it doesn't dictate the rules. I can walk down the street and break a bunch of cultural norms, like sticking out my middle finger, for example, and I'm not going to get arrested by the culture police because I broke a cultural norm. It sets the expectation, not the rule. Then he said that communication is not necessarily assimilation. My response is simply two parts. Yes, it's part of assimilation. The other part is the non-communication-based attributes, which I mentioned in subpoint B. Then he said assimilation hurts trust. My response is simply all culture should value. His reason why he said assimilation hurts trust, he brought back to his first example of the Native Americans. I've already established how that's not an example of the resolution. Finally, he said that my second contention was isolation. My response is cause and effect. The different cultural barriers in China caused the isolation. Sure, multiculturalism itself may not have been the isolation, but it was a cause and effect. And finally, he responded to my contention 3 by saying individual choice. My response is simply the value held by its members. When culture values something, that means its members are valuing things, and that is why this was an example of a smaller group assimilating to a larger group. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be using up my remaining prep time. I'll be back. Okay, awesome. So I'll assume that everyone is set to go then. This is going to be a 6-minute rebuttal speech. Let's get started. I'd like to point you back to the analogy that I gave of my family and my 2 younger brothers. Even though my 2 younger brothers wanted Chick-fil-A, because my family as a whole made the decision to go eat, no, wanted KFC, because my family made a decision to go eat Chick-fil-A, my brothers had to go along with the ride anyway. This is how the resolution works. And because culture shouldn't be the one making the decision for you, I urge a negative ballot. I'm going to be going through some arguments and then listing off some voting issues or reasons why, at the end of this debate round, you should vote negative. And my first one you can write down is liberty highest. Liberty highest. Now, under my value of liberty, he basically said that not no impact because assimilation doesn't violate. And this is I'm going to respond to this based on his whole idea in this case of how all cultures valuing and how it's always voluntary. My response is unrealistic. My opponent's position is that everyone in a culture is going to agree on everything. That's simply not true. Not everyone in a country, not everyone in a culture wants to be assimilated, is going to want to assimilate. Not everyone is going to want to change their religion, they want to change their beliefs, to completely change their customs. That's simply unrealistic. And like my example, my two brothers, there will be people in a society, in a minority culture, that don't want to assimilate to the dominant culture provided. So liberty is of the utmost importance because remember, culture is the one valuing it. And valuing almost always leads to inaction. So if encouragement doesn't work, then pressure has to come into play. If pressuring people doesn't work, then it leads to force. So liberty is of the utmost importance, and he didn't really respond to the reason to prefer a fundamental human right. It is a fundamental human right. In and of itself, it is intrinsically good. And he agreed to the fact that without liberty, you can't improve as a society. You can't improve if you're oppressed and you're locked in your home. He agreed to this fact, thereby proving that liberty is the higher value, because without it, you can't even have my opponent's value. Let's get down to my second voting issue. You can write that down as prioritizing assimilation harms liberty. Prioritizing assimilation harms liberty. This goes back to the example of Native American boarding schools. I've already addressed the response of how all cultures should value, but he said what versus how. My response is no. My first response is no refutation. My opponent didn't really refute the fact that this was an example of forced assimilation toward Native Americans. My second response is voting affirmative allows for abuse. Because culture is the one valuing assimilation, it's going to allow for abuse. That's the reality of it. Remember that the resolution never specified which culture we are talking about. So we're not just talking about a culture like America. And so the reality is, if we vote for the affirmative side and we allow culture, sometimes the dominant culture, to value assimilation toward a minority that may not necessarily want to, it's going to allow for abuse. And this was a great example of this. We see this in history with the Aboriginals in Australia. We see this forced assimilation of the Native Americans in Canada. We've seen this throughout history, and it sets a precedent that if we value the affirmative side over the negative, it leads to abuse and it leads to a violation of liberty. Let's get down to my third voting issue, which is that of prioritizing multiculturalism upholds liberty. Prioritizing multiculturalism upholds liberty. This goes back to my application of Singapore. He basically said no impacts, but I've already addressed how liberty is of the utmost importance in today's round. And Singapore is a great example of this because in their society, of course, you have to follow the law, but you are encouraged to continue to preserve your unique culture and traditions, and you also appreciate and respect that of others. It is a great example of how multiculturalism upholds liberty, and it shows that multicultural nations can also be successful. But let's get down to my opponent's case now. Again, under the criterion of mutual influence, he basically said expectations, not rules. My response is look at the real world. You look at countries right now like China or North Korea and countries in the Middle East. They suppress many ideas because they value assimilation, many of them good ideas. So the idea that truth will always rise to the surface without any hand is completely false. You look at the examples that I provided. And so the reality is, if we value assimilation over multiculturalism, it actually leads to a harming of mutual influence because it can often suppress ideas that the dominant culture doesn't deem as right. But multiculturalism allows for that marketplace of ideas to coexist. So let's get down to my opponent's first contention then of communication and trust. Well, again, he said two parts. My response is still not indicative of assimilation. Just because I go to Britain and I drive on the left side of the road and I'm able to communicate with them in the same language, it does not mean that I've actually assimilated. And because culture is the one valuing it, and sometimes assimilation can actually hurt and actually cause distrust, because assimilation can, from the dominant culture's perspective, cause them to think that some cultures are inferior to others and thereby they need to change. Under missionaries in China, he said, cause and effect. My response is non-essential. Multiculturalism is not inherently segregation. Multiculturalism is coexisting together in a society. It's not about completely isolating and separating yourselves. Under China Inland Mission, my response is no pressure. Hudson Taylor had no pressure from America to assimilate to China. The Chinese didn't have any pressure on Hudson, didn't pressure Hudson Taylor to assimilate. This was an example of individual choice. So my response still stands. So let's get down to my fourth voting issue, which is affirmative role not upheld. My opponent hasn't upheld his burden to prove that assimilation is best for culture as a whole across the world. And his idea that assimilation is voluntary, completely voluntary, is completely unrealistic and not real world. And so for all of these reasons, I would strongly urge a vote for the negative and for multiculturalism. Thank you.
All right, I will start my minute and 34 seconds of prep time as soon as my timer clicks up there. A minute and 34 seconds starting now. All right. I have a 3-minute speech. 3 minutes. The best way to influence a culture is to first be a part of it. It is because I believe that cultures should value becoming a part of the culture around them and thus being able to influence each other to improve the society that I stand that culture ought to value assimilation. Let's look at a couple voting issues. My first voting issue is simply what the resolution says. We're going to be discussing what the resolution is saying. My first response to what my opponent is saying about how this is completely unrealistic, like we can't expect people to voluntarily assimilate, my response is simply the question, why? We see in my example of Hudson Taylor that the China Inland Mission valued assimilation. I agree, no one pressured them to do it, and this completely stands against my opponent's philosophy that assimilation has to be pressured by someone. Immigrants throughout the ages have voluntarily assimilated, and my opponent just saying this is unrealistic, but why? My subpoint A under this voting issue you can write down as should. The resolution says should, and so it's saying what we're talking about, what the world should look like. And my opponent is basically saying, well, this isn't how the world looks like right now. Well, if the resolution were true, then the things in the resolution would be true, and the world would look like that. So simply, we're talking about the resolutional world. My opponent is simply saying it's not like that right now. I agree. Well, it should be like that, and that's what the resolution is saying. I have to defend the should. Now let's go to my second voting issue, which you can write down as liberty is not helpful. I'm going to be showing how, while liberty is incredibly valuable, and I agree with that, it simply is not a helpful value. Subpoint A is what versus how. Now, my opponent responded to my point when I brought this up in the last speech by saying basically no refutation. My response is a bad way to value assimilation. I completely refuted his point. His point was assimilation is bad because people have used it badly. And I've refuted that. Just because people have used it badly doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Then he said it allows for abuse. My response is any good thing can be abused. We agreed upon this, I think, because he didn't respond to my analogy of the free speech. Free speech is a good thing. It can be abused. Does that mean free speech is bad? No, it just means it can be abused. So just because us valuing assimilation allows for abuse doesn't mean it inherently will be abused, or doesn't mean it's a bad thing. My subpoint B under this voting issue you can write down as cultural value held by its members. And this is a critical point. My opponent keeps bringing up that basically we're talking about the culture overall valuing something while individuals may not want to. Think about it this way. If a culture values something, members of the culture will also value it. So my opponent is trying to distance the individuals of a culture valuing something from the actual culture valuing it itself. That simply is not the case. If the culture values assimilation, then the members of that culture will share in that cultural belief and will value assimilation. So the impact of this is simply, liberty is valuable, it's simply not helpful. My third voting issue is societal improvement should decide. My opponent keeps bringing up the real world, how in the real world we're going to be pressured and enforced and things like that. I simply like to bring up government versus culture. Government sets the rules, culture sets the expectations. We're talking about the expectations, not the rules. Then he talked about how basically it's not indicative, how just learning the language is not indicative of assimilation. My response is there are still two parts. There are many different cultural attributes to facilitate trust. Ultimately, we can see that regardless of the nitty-gritty of the picky applications, the definitions of assimilation and multiculturalism provide for commonality, less or more, and that is what will facilitate mutual influence. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for judging. Awesome job, Caleb. Again, congratulations
Yes,
on making it this far.
Congratulations to you too.
Yeah.
Great round.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.